Hi everyone. Today we're going to look at polygenic traits. Polygenic traits basically means that you have 3 or more genes that are controlling one trait. So most of the ones that we've looked at so far only involves one gene with perhaps an alternative allele that affects the phenotype of one trait. But now you have multiple alleles that affect one particular trait. In terms of what inheritance pattern they can be, polygenic traits can be dominant and recessive. Okay, those are the two most common ones that we know of and studied in the past. They can also be incomplete dominant, okay, which is something that we just looked at recently. And we can also find some evidence that many polygenic traits are also codominant, okay, having 2 genes that are more or less equally dominant over each other. When each of these genes are involved, there could be several different alleles or different versions of this gene. Okay, so if you think about eye color is controlled by several separate genes on different chromosomes. Here you have basically something similar where you have several different genes on many different chromosomes that affect the outcome of one particular trait. Okay, we're going to use basically heart disease as the example in a couple of minutes. But one of the things about polygenic traits is that these alleles, their effects are additive, meaning they build on each other. So we'll kind of see what that means when we start looking at heart disease. Now, just like heart disease and most other common disorders that are affected or influenced by genetics, there is a portion of the environment that also has an influence on whether or not these particular disorders come about. So we say that many of these traits are partly influenced by environmental factors, things that you might not be able to control, okay, and also things in your environment that you can control, okay, but perhaps choose not to. So let's move on to the next slide. Some common human traits that involve multiple alleles is basically height, skin color, heart disease, schizophrenia, depression, and intelligence. So of all the disorders on the list here, okay, heart disease and schizophrenia and depression are fairly common. Okay, most of us can understand what heart disease is. Schizophrenia is an older term. There is a specific explanation for schizophrenia, but a lot of people kind of also classify schizophrenia with multiple personality disorders, okay, which technically are a separate thing, but still, I believe both of them are affected by your genetics. Depression, we're talking about clinical depression, not necessarily just feeling sad because of one random action that has occurred, but we're talking about long-term depression having some kind of association with your genetics. And of course, has been evidence of intelligence, okay, being linked with genetics as well, because you can pass on certain intelligences that we can see from family member to offspring, from generation to generation. So when we look at these particular traits, the phenotypes typically occupy something called a bell-shaped curve. Okay, let's move that out of the way. What this means is you have a gradient of phenotypes. So it's not like you are just tall and short, but there's a mix in between tall and short. Okay, that gives you an average. So we know that at this end here, a lot of the phenotypes are basically influenced by a set of dominant alleles. On the other side, you have phenotypes that are represented by the recessive alleles. Okay, and then you have all the ones that are in the middle. Okay, it depends on whether you have dominant or recessive alleles or which type of dominant alleles. Okay, because if you have a codominant pattern, there might be more than one dominant gene that affects your phenotype. So when we look at all these patterns together, it's much more complex than some of the other traits that we've looked at, especially the ones that I've given you examples of at the very beginning of this unit. So if we switch over our focus to heart disease, I'm just going to move my bubble out of the way. Most single gene disorders, okay, the one that we kind of looked at quite a bit throughout the unit is cystic fibrosis. Okay, that's caused by one recessive gene. So it's easier for us to predict how that gene is passed from parent to offspring. Okay, and we can follow it quite easily on a pedigree as well. Okay, so the likelihood of getting that cystic fibrosis gene is basically 1 in 10,000. Now, when you compare it to heart disease, okay, which is a polygenic disorder involving multiple alleles and genes, the rate or the occurrence is basically 1 in 3. Okay, so much, much greater chance of getting heart disease than cystic fibrosis. So there's a multitude of different disorders that are similar to this. So it's not only just heart disease, but it's diabetes, it's colon cancer. All of these are affected by multiple genes on different chromosomes. And when it's on multiple genes on different chromosomes, it's going to be hard for you to predict how these genes are inherited. Okay? So instead of using traditional means of tracking, okay, and saying, oh, you have a 25% chance of getting this, or you have a 75% chance of being normal, okay, we look at different risk factors. Okay? So when we're talking about heart disease, there are some things that you do that will involve a lot of risk in terms of developing heart disease. And there are things that you can probably do to reduce your risk of getting heart disease. One of the biggest things is looking at your family pedigree. Okay? Figuring out which individuals in your family might have a problem with heart disease, and then trying to trace it back, okay, and see what kind of genes are being inherited, okay, from different family members. So if you have a better family history, that's a little bit more clear-cut in terms of who has heart disease and who doesn't, you can make better predictions. Okay. So in terms of how we predict, we kind of gauge things by risk level. So if you're low risk, it doesn't mean that you'll never have heart disease. It's just not likely for you to have heart disease or develop heart disease. If you're medium or high risk, there's a greater chance that you might develop heart disease. Even high risk individuals sometimes don't necessarily develop heart disease. Okay? It really depends on a lot of different factors. Okay? And genetics is just one part of it. So if you kind of look at the graphic that's on the right-hand side here, I've listed a few statistics. Okay, I believe this one is mostly American. Okay, but you can kind of just read on your own and look at the facts. But a lot of it is kind of just pointing towards that many people in the United States, okay, are at risk. It's the #1 disease that leads to death in the United States, and for the most part, that's also true for Canada. It is probably one of the top 2 or 3 that lead to heart disease, if not #1. So here's some Canadian stats. For every 7 minutes, someone in Canada dies from heart disease or stroke. Okay, a lot of the times, heart disease is preventable. Okay, but again, it depends on how you're living your life. So it's not just the genes that matter. Okay. it's also your lifestyle. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about how your lifestyle can impact whether or not you're in the low risk, medium risk, or high risk category of developing heart disease. So I just want to reiterate what's being said on the slide. Just because you have the genes for heart disease doesn't necessarily mean you're going to develop heart disease. You're likely just more in the high risk category than those who don't have the genes. Okay. So the other side of the story here is the environmental factor. A lot of you probably already know at least one or two things that you can do to prevent heart disease, like for yourself and for those that you love. A lot of it has to do with exercise and your level of fitness. If you're obese, you're at a higher level of developing heart disease, there's a greater risk. So weight management becomes an issue for most people, especially when they get older and their metabolism starts to decrease. It's a little bit easier for people to start gaining more weight. And if they don't change their lifestyle and their eating habits and their fitness level, that's going to be a problem. Nutrition is always a major issue. Everyone likes to eat good food, and not everyone eats healthy. Not everyone who eats healthy actually takes in the proper nutrition either. Some people are devoid of certain nutrients that they require, and sometimes people perhaps eat too much of one type of nutrition. Okay, all these little things eventually fit into the big picture. So looking at nutrition as a factor that affects heart disease is pretty fair game. Stress. This could be any form of stress or anxiety. Okay. In particular, if you are at chronic levels of stress, your blood pressure is probably higher than normal as well. Okay, so if you're stressed for a test or an assignment or a project that's due and you don't have it done, okay, that kind of stress is normal. But if you're feeling anxious all the time, if you have a condition where your blood pressure and your heartbeat, okay, is just, being very quickly, that's a little bit different. Okay, it is more chronic stress. So in terms of regular stress, as long as you don't get into situations that causes you a lot of stress all the time, then I think you're okay. But there are some people who live their life through stress. Okay, and for those types of people, they do need to keep an eye on their blood pressure to make sure that it's at proper levels. And speaking of levels, there's also cholesterol levels. Okay, so this ties in with nutrition and it ties in with weight management and your fitness levels. Okay, they're all kind of interconnected together. But you've heard of good cholesterol, bad cholesterol, right? Cholesterol from fats, if it's too high in your bloodstream, it's going to cause problems, especially with the functioning of your arteries and veins. Most of us probably don't smoke anymore, okay? But we can also inhale smoke from pollution, from car exhaust, okay? Just from our general environment. So, for example, if you live in Los Angeles, okay, where the air quality is typically worse than what it is in Winnipeg, that type of pollution will contribute to a higher level of heart disease. And then finally, the one last quote-unquote environmental factor is just awareness of the problem. Okay, people who are not fully educated, okay, people who are perhaps not up to date with the current science of heart disease, okay, that generally does play an impact, because if you know the general risk factors, if you know how each one of these environmental factors impacts your overall health, it goes a long way to reducing the risk level that you're in. So again, another graphic here. This was taken about 5 or 6 years ago. So the baby boomers, they did a study, and most of them, like 85% of them, said that they're eating not enough vegetables. Okay, so there's that nutrition aspect. 62% of them say that they're overweight. Okay, one, they are getting older, so it's much harder for them to maintain a healthy weight. But I feel like a lot of them probably can't maintain a healthy weight because they're not as active and they're choosing not to be active, or medically they're prevented from being active, so that also increases the risk. 30% of them are stressed about something. Okay, it says often or always, right? So again, little situations where you get stressed isn't a big deal, but if you're always stressed or you're stressed more often than you would like to be, then that eventually starts to add up and build. So the funniest one is the last one, because 80% of them think that they're actually healthy, and they think that their doctor would agree that they're healthy, even though they might not be. So that's the lack of awareness or education piece. Okay, just because you feel really good, okay, you're content with the way you are right now, doesn't mean that you're necessarily healthy. Okay, your body may have adapted and gone used to a certain level of stress or malnutrition or obesity. Okay, but just because your body can take it right now doesn't mean that it will always be able to do that. So at some point, it catches up with you. Okay, so if we look at normal blood pressure, a normal person should have a blood pressure of 120/80. A person with heart disease usually have a higher blood pressure. Okay, and under high risk, it can be as high as 140, okay, over 80 or higher. In terms of beats per minute, the average is around 72, but the range is between 60 to 80 beats per minute. And for a person with heart disease already, their heartbeat will be about 120 to 240. And this is the resting heartbeat, okay, just by sitting down and such. So this is very irregular. And one of the things that contributes to this increase in blood pressure and increased heart rate is basically the condition of your arteries. So some of you guys may remember this from grade 11, but a normal artery kind of looks like this one on the left, okay? But every time that you start eating unhealthy and your arteries are collecting cholesterol, there's a plaque buildup, okay? These little fatty deposits that basically stick to the sides of your arteries, making them very inelastic and inflexible, and therefore making it harder for your body to pump blood back to the heart or to the body. So this definitely is a major factor in increasing your risk of heart disease. So there is going to be a particular, let's say, activity that I wanted to do with you guys related to heart disease. Okay, I just have to work out the details of it, given that we have this whole COVID situation. But hopefully once I get that figured out, you'll have a better idea of how heart disease is passed along genetically, okay, and what the probabilities are, whether you are in low risk, medium risk, or high risk. Okay, so in terms of polygenic traits, that's all I really want to say for heart disease for now. Okay, the next time that we meet, we'll look at some different techniques for basically detecting different types of genetic problems, okay, called detecting genetic disorders. But again, I'll save that for another video. Thanks, guys. See you soon.